Hey everyone, I am Brian Tomlinson, head of content here at Staffbase, and welcome to another episode of the Aspire to Inspire podcast. Today's guest is Dr. David Burkus, and he is one of the world's leading business thinkers and a best-selling author, helping leaders build their best teams ever. His insights have been featured in outlets like the Wall Street Journal, the Harvard Business Review, and NPR. And he brings a unique perspective on leadership, on teamwork, and creativity. His books, including Best Team Ever, Friend of a Friend, and The Myth of Creativity, all challenge our conventional wisdom on how to offer practical strategies to inspire change and drive results in our teams. In this episode, we'll dive into actionable insights on his work and including how to foster high performing teams, rethink management norms, and how to become a better networker, even on LinkedIn. David, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Hey, so actually, I want to jump in at a very interesting area. So I know that you are a black belt in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu and also Judo, right? If I'm not
Yep.
mistaken.
Yep.
Yeah. What made you start with that? What made you get into that?
Yeah. Okay. So this is gonna get a little weird for a second. I had actually always grown up in some form of martial arts when I was younger. I did taekwondo, like a lot of people took, like, you're 8, 9, 10 years old. You take karate classes from some strip mall karate studio, and you watch all of the crazy Hollywood action movies, right? And I did all of that. I mean, growing up throughout most of my childhood, it was just sort of fun. It's a cool. There are a lot of sports that are you're part of a team, but you're also an individual, so it's your own individual performance, etc. That was kind of fun. Obviously, feeling super cool like a great fighter is great too, I guess, from a confidence standpoint. And then when I was in college, I kind of walked away from all of it. Just had too much time studying. Was a double major. Didn't have a car on campus, which made getting off campus to do any of those types of activities impossible. Right. And so gave up on all of it, except that I was in university when this really weird esoteric competition called the Ultimate Fighting Championship, which everyone knows now, started going live. And at the time, it was like the events were barely going on. You basically you had to go to Blockbuster Video. Yeah, I'm dating myself here. You had to go to Blockbuster Video and rent old VHS or DVD versions of these things, which when you're at that age and you're a college student, you're like, yes, that's the prescription for a perfect Friday night, right? Like, let's go get pizza, 2 liters of Coke, and a UFC DVD and watch it. And so I watched this guy named Hoist Gracie, right? And these jujitsu people just destroy everybody else, right? Which to me was not only exciting, but also like I wasted, 20 years of my life studying point fighting and strip mall karate, right? I clearly need to change this all out. And so then when I graduated out, got settled with a job, et cetera, had the disposable income to actually pay gym fees and what have you, I looked around in my city, and the only thing close at the time was judo. So I actually started in judo. Fun fact, actually, I trained at the judo academy that during UFC 4, the Gracies went to do their training leading up to that event, because that event was held in Tulsa, where I currently was, which is just a fun fact. I didn't train with them at all. Bears no reflection on me.
6 degrees of separation, right?
Exactly,
Which we'll
right?
get into later.
And then as jiu-jitsu as a sport grew, one of those gyms opened up, and so I started cross training for a long time. Eventually, after I got a black belt in judo, I kind of stopped competing, stopped training in that, and focused entirely in jiu-jitsu. Did that through my 20s and 30s. In my 30s, it got a little bit harder. You start having kids, you're married, you have kids, you have whatever. And so now I still go, I'm headed there actually after we record today. I still go train probably 2 or 3 times a week, but really I'm much more focused on keeping myself a little tuned and then working with a lot of the younger guys that are still competing and that sort of stuff. So it's still a lot of fun, but I guess I should say I'm nowhere near as dangerous as I used to be.
What tell me then, what did you learn? What mental lessons or frameworks did you learn from judo that leaders can take into their day to day?
Yeah, well, from judo especially, I think Jigoro Kano, the founder of judo, was really the story of judo is a really interesting one. For those of you that don't, we'll go down this rabbit hole because it's a lot of fun. At the time, over 100 years ago, before Jigoro Kano founded judo, there were all sorts of what they called jujitsus, right? Which were individual, very master centric on one person and his collection of techniques. And a lot of them were like very dangerous techniques. Like if you watch a lot of parody comedy karate videos on YouTube or whatever, it's like block this and then gouge their eye out, and just way too dangerous stuff that you could not practice on another opponent. And all Jigoro Kano did was take all of those fighting elements of judo, remove the things that would cause injuries, the striking, the especially striking vital areas, et cetera, and focus entirely on the grappling. The theory being you could practice grappling at 100% and not injure your training partner, right? So the idea here is because you can train it at 100% and not slower, it's more effective in a real life scenario because your body is used to operating at that 100%. Alongside that, in order to make that work, you have to get into what's kind of the first principle of training in judo, which is what he called mutual respect and benefit, right? The idea being, or sometimes mutual welfare and benefit translates differently, but the idea being that you take responsibility for the health and safety of your partner. Yes, you are going at 100%, and you're even attempting to pin them down, to choke them out, to throw them with full force, speed, and control. At the same time, they're your training partner. So you're 100% responsible for their safety and well-being. Candidly, when I go and work with really dysfunctional teams, that's the first thing I see missing, right? Is you have a team, especially as you get higher up in an organization, you start to have a team that looks at each other as collaborators, but also as competitors. In other words, if I get an opportunity to sort of step over you and position myself for promotion, I'm going to take it. There's not a sense of mutual welfare and benefit on a lot of those dysfunctional teams. We would, from a research standpoint, because I'm super nerdy, we would probably most correlate this to what we would call psychological safety, right? For those out there who are listening, is like, oh, that sounds a lot like psych safety. It is, right? This idea, again, that there's a sense of trust and respect for the other individual, that you're not going to do anything that is deliberately trying to put them down, because then they're not going to bring their whole and their best self to work, et cetera. And so it's funny to me that my first exposure, like when I was in graduate school and really diving into the research on psych safety, my first exposure was like, no, I learned this 5 or 6 years ago when we started training in judo. This is a 100-year-old concept, right? That's responsible for creating all sorts of champions and for creating this martial art that spread across the world, et cetera. This was already something Jigoro Kano found out 100 years ago. We're just now the data is matching up with it, which is always exciting.
Yeah, no, I mean that's an amazing story. I can only imagine that what a good fit that is for leaders and particularly for teams, right? So I mean, how do you see that? Because judo, when you look at judo or any martial art, it looks like a very one person sport, right? How does that translate into creating a team and a strong performing group of people?
Yeah, ironically, I think those types of sports correlate better to most people's experience of work, at least knowledge work, in that you work with a team, but you're still responsible for individual objectives, right? Now, I've actually been a huge proponent in the past of team-based incentives, team-based rewards, team-based incentive compensation, that sort of thing. I'll be honest with you, I'm losing that argument, right? The reality that we work in, and most of the times our bonuses, our incentive compensation, our prospects for promotion, they're all still individual. On the other hand, you still work with a whole lot of people that influence your individual performance. And training in those individual sports is kind of the same way, whether it's martial arts, whether it's something like track and field, whether it's swimming, like you have a stable, you have a team of people who push you to be better, right? And you still want them to succeed, and you need them to push you. You need that intra-team competitiveness, but you're still ultimately responsible on an individual level. I think that actually speaks to people's experience of work much more often. I've got, like, if you look at Boris Groysberg's research, in particular in the finance industry, but across a lot of different industries, he suggests that up to 60% of individual performance is not explained by the talent a person has, but it's the team they're on, the company they're a part of, the resources they have access to, external factors, right? Doesn't mean talent's not important, but all of those other external factors have a huge influence on whether or not you can turn the talent you have into high performance. And that's kind of the thing I like about and have always sort of liked about judo, jiu-jitsu, individual sports, like I said, like gymnastics and lots of other things, is that idea. You're part of a team. You feel that sense of belonging. You've got those people pushing you, giving you constructive feedback, et cetera. But ultimately, and they're going to push your individual performance, but at the same time, you're still thinking individually about what you are. I think there's a lot more leadership lessons there than anywhere else. In fact, in my newest book, I get kind of a little bit of tease for this. And my newest book's all about high performing teams. And there's only 3 sports references in the entire book. One is gymnastics. One is curling, which is technically a team sport, but each individual slides the rock themselves. And the other is baseball, which of the major team sports in the United States is probably still the most individualistic team sport. And I think there's a specific reason for that, which is, again, you're part of a team and you need the team to push you, but you're still responsible for your individual aims as well.
Yeah, I'm happy that you jumped on sports because I think that's something that particularly probably leaders in HR and people who are talent recruiting probably need to think about as well, right? Because I think you may have mentioned that before. Is in sports you see someone has a big trade and you're like, oh yes, like they're on my team, but then they don't perform,
Yeah.
right? And I think a lot of times in business, it's probably very similar. Have you seen that before?
Oh yeah, no. So first of all, I see it from sports all the time because I am at heart a Philadelphia Eagles football fan. I was born in Philly, and I have seen us acquire so many talented players who then fell apart because of culture. And then the only Super Bowl we've ever won, we won with second stringers because of an incredible culture.
Yep.
And I think you see the exact same thing in HR and recruiting, et cetera. This is funny. I actually once asked this to a group of HR folks in the finance industry, which I always thought, I'm setting this up for this specific reason. I asked them, have you ever had a hire that you thought was going to perform really, really well, and then they get in and they become a part of the team and it just falls apart? And almost everybody raises their hand. And then I say, really? Because everyone here is in finance or banking. And if ever there were people who knew that past performance is not indicative of future results, you'd think it would be the people in finance who have to promise that every time they talk about an investment fund or some other savings product, right? But we still do it. And in fact, there's even some research that suggests that we look at we evaluate talent, not even based on past performance, but based on things we perceive to be their potential over their track record. So we're judging on, what did you do before? What do we think you could possibly do here? Which is just an educated guess. Remember, there's no evidence that they're actually going to achieve higher levels of performance in our firm. And then we just ignore, hey, what team are we putting them on? What are we going to move? And a bad culture will destroy a high performer every single time. Starting in probably 2016, I became a huge advocate of bringing the whole team into hiring decisions as much as you can, right? This plays out in a couple different ways. Like I talk a lot about how in places like Whole Foods, like even at the corporate level, you have the team individual hires on kind of probation for 60 to 90 days. And then the team actually has to take a vote on whether or not they're a fit. But I even love organizations from whether it's knowledge work, or I've even seen it in factory work, that will actually train individual contributors who are going to be a part of that person's team in interviewing skills so that they can sit on the interview. That doesn't mean you still need people from HR in there, right? Because you can't have them ask illegal questions and that sort of stuff. But the idea that, hey, bringing new talent into the organization is everyone's business, because how they fit is going to be a huge factor in whether or not they make us better or we make them worse, right? And so training everybody to be a part of that and to look for that, I think, is a huge solution. I think if somebody's performance rests on the team that they're a part of, then that team should probably have a say, maybe not the majority say, but should have a say in who actually gets to join the
Yeah.
team.
We actually do that. Like when we hire someone, at least for my team, it might come across a little bit intimidating, but we try to make a really nice environment and bring people in, have them do like a presentation. But in that round, they meet the team,
Yeah.
right? And because we want to make sure that that person fits to our culture, to our values, and
Yeah.
that way they also feel comfortable with the people they're going to work with, right?
Oh, I love that. No, I love
But
that. And unfortunately, you have to agree, it's still not the norm for a lot of organizations, right? Like
no,
a lot of
no.
organizations follow the same process. Honestly, a lot of hiring looks a lot like modern dating, right? Like, okay, you have all of these applicants and you have some HR generalist, 20-something-year-old person whose job it is to screen, or you have AI just screening people out, right? And doing the initial interview.
Swipe right.
Right, right. You have them doing the initial interview, which is actually just sort of as a phone screen, right? I mean, that to me feels equivalent to swipe right or swipe left, right? You're just trying to filter as many people
Yep.
out. When you have people that have promise, They mostly just interview with the manager, the person that's going to be their boss, right? And then as you whittle it down to maybe one or two people, what do? You go meet the parents, right? In other words, you go interview with the boss's boss. And then if there's a fit there and they have your blessing and approval, we make a hire. All the while, like the rest of the extended family never gets to meet you, right? Which is no
Yeah.
surprise why Thanksgiving is always such a disastrous holiday in the United States, and also why hiring doesn't seem to work out a lot of times, right? Is that we've never brought all of these
Yeah.
other people who the success of the relationship depends on. We never brought them into the decision. It boggles my mind. You know, I hear more and more examples of that. I love what you all are doing. It boggles my mind that we're still taking a very individualistic approach to who gets to join our organization, all the while paying lip service to these words like teams and what have you. And then again, not thinking about that
Yeah.
team fit.
Yeah, no, no, absolutely. I mean, that comes back to the culture topic, right? And I think one of the things that we talk about, and you mention quite often in your book as well, is psychological safety, right? And creating that safe space for someone. But it's something but just like you said, we talk about it a lot, but it's kind of hard to achieve, or it makes it seem as if it's hard to achieve.
Yeah.
What do you think are some of the easiest things that leaders could do to create a safer space that builds that trust that someone needs within the team and within an
Yeah,
organization?
well, I think a couple things. I was just reading some interesting research on this maybe a month or so ago, and I think there's two big barriers the way I see it, and the one is one I hadn't seen until this research revealed it. The first barrier I think is a misunderstanding of what psych safety means, right? And even like when we use that term, sort of a safe space, I think a lot of people, I think that term's great in the corporate setting, but then a lot of people think back to these like headline grabbing stories of safe spaces in college where there's like cookies and milk in case you feel triggered and all of this. They're just like, okay, that seems a little bit too much coddling. Is that what we're going? And then you end up with a lot of leaders who just reject the concept entirely, right? Which is again not what we're talking about. We're not talking about blanket amnesty for underperformance. You're never going to be challenged or pushed. We're not even talking about you're never going to hear an idea that makes you uncomfortable. What we are talking about is when you see something you disagree with or that makes you uncomfortable, that you see as a problem, you feel respected enough to speak up and point it out, right? And in doing so, slightly change the culture and to have that conversation, right? And that word respect is probably the other thing I think we get wrong. Is the way I see psychological safety. If you look at Amy Edmondson's original research and her definition, is she calls it this climate of mutual trust and respect. And I think those two things are reciprocal. In other words, you can build as much trust on a team as you want. You could do the trust falls. You could take a personality test. You could do whatever it takes to sort of bring somebody together. You do all of that in the service of getting someone to take an interpersonal risk, like speaking up because they see something they disagree with or that they find uncomfortable, right? But it could also be just sharing a new idea that seems sort of out of the box. It could be talking about a failure. It could be all of these different things that are interpersonally risky, right? That might risk judgment or atmosphere in a dysfunctional environment that maybe people have past trauma and past baggage for, might make them feel uncomfortable. You build trust to get people to take that risk. If you don't know how to respect people on the other side of that risk, then their trust is going to diminish. We've all had this situation in our career. We spoke up to point out some great idea that we were really proud of, or to point to something that we saw as wrong, and we got shot down immediately. And what happened right after we get shot down? We don't trust that person or that team as much anymore. So there's a reciprocal thing at play. And I think a lot of leaders don't pay enough attention to the respect side. And I get it because it's hard, right? Like it's hard to demonstrate active listening and respect and consideration when someone's disagreeing with your idea. It's hard. I get it. But the reward is worth it, right? Because what you see is you get to see a lot more of what reality looks like. You have a lot fewer blind spots when you have people on your team who are willing to speak up. In fact, I don't ask questions about trust when I am working with individual leaders. The first question I ask to gauge psychological safety is, when was the last time someone on your team disagreed with you? And how did it go? If they can't remember
Yeah.
a time, we've got a huge problem. But if they can, I want to know, what did you do? What was your response? Right? Did you immediately go to defend your idea, or did you hear them out and listen to them? You don't have to agree with them in the end, but you do have to give them, to use your word, you do have to give them a safe space to get that idea out there without that risk of judgment, if you want to keep your team honest and sharing the beautiful diversity of all of their opinions. So you have to pair that sense of trust with that sense of respect.
Awesome. Awesome. I mean, what are like two quick actionable things that leaders could do to be able to build that safe space, though.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
know you
So
mentioned active listening, so I mean that's the start. Listen, and then
well, so okay,
what
let's not
next?
actually make that the start, right? You asked for two, so we'll go trust and we'll go respect, right? Because of the reciprocal nature. On the trust side, I think the best thing leaders can do is be willing to be vulnerable themselves. And when I say vulnerability here, I don't mean deep Brene Brown levels of vulnerability. That's great if you can get there. For most people, that's way too much information. Like you don't have to, when you're done listening to this episode, you don't have to go tell your whole team that you feel like your parents never loved you. You don't need that level of vulnerability, right? But talking about your own mistakes, talking about your own oversights, or even just, I mean, for leaders, one of the most powerful things you can say is, I don't know. What do you think?
Mm,
Because you're a leader, you're supposed to have all the answers, right? But when you are actually willing to say, like, okay, I'm at a loss here. Who can help me figure this out? What you're doing is demonstrating that you're willing to talk about your own weaknesses, your own knowledge gaps, et cetera, and invite that team in. And that's an act of trust in and of itself. You're telling the team that you trust them by being willing to be that vulnerable, right? So that's the vulnerability side. And then we'll go to the active listening side. But again, I think it's important to talk about this from a respect standpoint. Active listening doesn't necessarily just mean like we all took that Com 101 class or that initial training and we're active listening. That means eye contact. Like, well, first of all, how do I do eye contact when all of my employees are on Zoom? Like, how do I do that? What active really listening really means is that you've convinced the person you're there to hear what they have to say and not just think about what you're going to say in response, right? So, okay, eye contact and nods and nonverbals are a part of that. But the far more important thing is to make sure that when they're done speaking, you don't just jump into their advice. You take a second and circle back for understanding to make sure we're actually aligned. Hey, what I hear you saying in all of that is this, or it sounds like the crux of the issue is this. Did I get that right? And then after you've checked for understanding, explore the idea even more. Tell me more about that. What have you tried? What do you think is the cause of this? Right? What are your ideas about why this is happening? Because here's the other thing. If you don't already have a lot of psych safety on your team, then most of the time when people are coming to you with problems, for example, or with any of these sort of interpersonal risks, they're not coming to you with the real problem. They're coming to you with like a sanitized, minimized version of the problem that they would feel comfortable admitting because they're still worried about your reaction. And so if you just jump right into advice, great, here's what we're going to do. You're giving advice on the wrong problem and you're still not helping them see that they can trust you, right, to share the reality of what's really going on. So when you check for understanding and you ask those follow-up questions, you get more of the story and you also get that person feeling truly heard and considered, feeling respected. And so their level of trust goes up. Then you can get into your advice. I'm not saying don't ever offer your take on what they should do. People do come to you with problems and want ideas for solutions. That's part of being a leader. But make sure they're actually coming to you with the real problem and that they feel heard when they come to you before you jump into that advice.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that makes me think a lot about Mark Fields from Ford,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that story, because a lot of times, it takes that courage also to be able to be that first person to say, well, hey, everything's not okay,
Yeah.
right? Especially if it's in a environment where that's in the past has not been accepted.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. So it's probably one of my favorite case studies ever. I've had the opportunity to spend hours of time on multiple occasions with Alan Mulally, who's my pick because he's still alive. My pick for the greatest living CEO, even though he's not a CEO. He's still around and he's still amazing. But 2006, Alan took over the turnaround at Ford. Ford was in a world of hurt back then. They were their strategic plan for that year, the annual estimates that they put out to shareholders was that they were going to lose $17 billion in fiscal year 2006, right? Like, you think your company has problems. Here's a company that's admitted that if everything goes right, we're still going to lose $17 billion, right? Their stock price was trading at $1 a share. And in comes Alan to try and take over. And the first thing he noticed is this level, everything we've been talking about with the dysfunction, right? That's happening at the senior leadership team at Ford. People see the other members of the team as their competition for promotion. Everybody's trying to cover their own butts. Nobody's trying to admit any weaknesses. Nobody's coming to anybody with problems because problems are an admission of weakness, right? It's this very, very, I always want to call it a toxic culture, but I have to pause there because when I when I wrote about Alan and this Ford story in the book, I sent him the whole chapter for context. And the only notes that he gave me were not on his quotes or anything like that. Just the 2 times I wrote the word toxic to describe the initial culture, he crossed them out and he said, that's a little harsh, which is like trademark Alan Mulally, right? Like, so Alan comes in, and one of the first things he realizes is we need to tell it like it is. We need to talk about what's really going on. And we need to talk about these problems. And to do that, we have to build a culture of psychological safety, a culture of trust and respect, right? And I think what gets missed in this story a lot of times is before Mark is willing to summon that courage, what actually has to happen is several cultural shifts that demonstrate that respect piece. So Alan had several rules for interactions, right? There's several different rules for when we're in meetings. Here's how they're going to go, right? One of the rules I think that stands out the most is, because it seems so trivial, but it turned out to be one of the most important ones, is he said, we never make a joke at someone else's expense. Now, this is a company based in Detroit, Michigan. I don't know if you've been to Detroit, Michigan, right? But it's a very sarcastic. I grew up in Philadelphia and then lived in Boston. Similar culture, right? We're a very dry, sarcastic, bust people's chops type culture. My wife, it took 5 years for my wife to realize that my family didn't hate each other, right? Because every time we got together, all we did was rag on each other, right? That's just the culture we were in. But what Alan recognized was that you can't build if there's those little acts of disrespect, because a joke made at someone else's expense is never funny to them. It's funny to everybody else, but it's not funny to them, right? And those little acts of disrespect were undermining that sense of trust, right? And this took time. It was 8 weeks of meeting together and everyone denying their problems before Mark Fields took that initial risk, right? But eventually, as you change the climate on the team, you get someone who's willing to speak up and say, hey, here's a problem that we're having. We're not going to be able to launch the Ford Edge in time, and I need help figuring out what the new timeline is going to be, how we're going to announce it, right? I need help. It took a huge amount of courage to get there to that point where he said, I need help. Little known fact, Mark's team actually tried to talk him out of giving that report. Team meetings, senior leadership team meetings happened every Thursday morning. Every Wednesday afternoon, most of the senior leaders would meet with their direct reports to prepare for the Thursday morning meeting. And on that Wednesday, Mark's team underneath him was like, Mark, you can't tell anybody. Like, we're all fired if you tell anybody. They were all worried about what was going to happen, right? But he did it. And Alan's response, Alan met Mark's trust, his risk, with respect again. Everybody assumed that, old leadership would have torn Mark's head off, would have escorted him out, would have called security on the guy and said, you're fired immediately. And instead, Alan started clapping. Hey, Mark, that's great visibility. All right. What can we do for him? And they didn't solve the problem in a day, but the climate of the team changed, right? Because they saw, wait a minute, I can actually share what's really going on. I'm not going to be fired or berated or any of those other acts of disrespect if I step out and trust in this leader and in this team, right? And so over time, Alan was the CEO and led the senior leadership team for 8 years. And over time, they shifted from trading at $1 a share to $17 a share, because they went from losing $17 billion to a $6.6 billion profit. And I think the coolest thing is when Alan announced his resignation on the heels of that, posting that $6.6 billion profit, he also made a recommendation for who should succeed him as the CEO. And he recommended Mark Fields. Now, I think that's a really cool story, and it'd be great if we stopped there. But time doesn't stop. And so here's what's happened afterwards. Mark made it about 18 months. And then ever since then, there's been an ongoing succession of CEOs of Ford. New ones not doing so hot. I bet they wish they could have Alan back, right? Because what Alan understood is that trust isn't a one and done thing. We need to be constantly monitoring each other's behavior to make sure that we're matching respect with those acts of risks that come out of trust. And I don't know that any leaders who followed Alan really truly understood that this is a constant thing, not a one and done thing.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think looking and having that vision, that long-term vision of what is this culture going to be like, right? And what values are we going to have? I think that's also critical, especially in such a short-term world that we kind of operate in, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the thing that always boggles my mind on this story is, again, it took 8 weeks from the time Alan took over and said, here's what the culture is going to look like, for Mark to step up in risk. Can you imagine being a leader and saying, hey, here's the standard that we're going to adhere to, and then watch your team fall short of that standard for 8 straight weeks and not get frustrated, just be patient with them, recognize that culture change takes time, et cetera? I mean, I think it's absolutely amazing to think about, right? That you can withstand that for 2 straight months of watching people fall short of the standard before the first opportunity to demonstrate what the new standard is pops up. It's just incredible to think about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, let's touch on one other topic for high performing teams. And this is the concept of being pro-social,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I really love what you've talked about, because I think Simon Sinek has to always told us start with why, and we believe it, we know it's important. But I think your take on that is more like start with who,
Yeah, no,
right?
it's
Good.
exactly, and in fact, there were several times where that's the phrase we wanted to use, and then we kept people thinking like, well, there's no reason to like poke him in the eye over the whole thing, because I don't think he's wrong, right? I think
Yep. Yep.
Simon popularized the conversation that organizational psychologists and leadership scholars were having at the same time, which was that, hey, this new, whether it's this new generation or whether it's where we are as a society and in our own sort of cultural value, like people want to know their work matters, right?
Mm.
And you could call it Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you could call it whatever, but we got to a point where most people wanted to know why what they do matters. And so out came Simon with this idea that you need to start with why. He's not wrong. What we found since then in another decade of research is that most people's most compelling way to answer why is with a who. So why not start with who, right? And when I say who here, I specifically mean who is served by the work that we're doing. This doesn't mean you have to change, you have to have a company that's changing the world, or this doesn't mean you have to immediately talk about the way that we're fighting climate change, or we're restoring this neighborhood, or it isn't your CSR campaigns. You don't have to change your whole company to a nonprofit. You just have to make sure you're having a conversation about, hey, the reason we do this is that this group of stakeholders' lives or work is made better by it. Oftentimes, too, that's the end user of our product, the end user of our service, et cetera. But for a lot of people, especially in a large organization, it's actually internal. In other words, if we do this, this is what happens. I was working with probably one of the weirdest teams I've ever worked with. Not weird in this, they're all great people, but weird in terms of like, I didn't even realize this function existed until they reached out to me. But they were the senior, they were what's called the escalation desk at a customer support agency. In other words, a lot of times when you reach out for products not working and you reach out for customer support, you're not actually talking to employees of the company, you're talking to another service that provides customer support for that company, right? And essentially, they were, if the problem sticks, it gets escalated. They were the top of the top, right? And so because they were the top of the top, they not only saw users' biggest problems, but they also had a direct line to the senior leadership team of the company that had hired them. Because what senior leader doesn't want to know what the biggest problems with their product is? So they began to see their own role, again, not as necessarily solving the customer's problems, but as being the bridge, the liaison, right? Their who was sort of twofold, and their purpose was that we connect these two people. We are the people who keep this company on track because the senior leaders know what the problems are. And yeah, we solve the customer problems too, right? And that's what I mean. A lot of times your who can be internal. If you do great work, it helps this other team inside the company. You think about HR, right? HR is probably the foremost example of this. Your job fundamentally is to help everybody else in the organization do their best work. So your role is not necessarily about the company you work for's end users and product. Your who is going to be internal, right? And that's why I think that's the other reason I think we start with who and not why. The why is sort of the big organizational mission. And that's not invalid. We need that. I mean, no one wants to work for a purposeless organization, right? But our own individual, we were designed, we were evolved to judge our impact based on who we can see impacted. And for a lot of us in large organizations, this is someone else internal. And again, like I said, HR is a great example of that, where your who is not going to be how you fulfill the company mission. It's going to be how you equip people to do their best work so that they can fulfill the company mission.
Yeah, no, I love that explanation. Particularly if anyone from HR is listening, that's a really great overview of kind of like why you exist, right?
Yeah. I do a lot of work in employee engagement and employee experience and that sort of thing. And it's one of the ones where everybody struggles with like, well, who's our who? Because it's not the customer. I'm like, no, it's everyone you interact with, right? Because you shape the whole
Yeah,
thing that allows everybody else to perform, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
So who do you serve, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
I mean, let's shift over. So because I love there's something else that you have written about in your book, friend of a friend
Mhm.
of a friend of a friend.
Yeah.
right?
I had nothing to do
That
with the book cover, but it's my favorite cover out there because it just keeps going and
I
going and going. But that's how networks
yeah,
work.
I love it. Yeah, that's exactly it. And what I really like is that you have said that networking is actually a science, right? So it's not this thing that a lot of people. I love that you say, like, it makes you feel a little bit dirty, right? And but it's actually a science about it, right? Could you tell the listeners, like, what really makes it a science and why is it so important?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, first on the dirty concept, right? I mean, fundamentally, the whole reason I wrote the book is I became fascinated with organizational networks and organizational network analysis. And then I noticed every time I started talking about it, people kind of rejected the premise because that word network made them feel weird. They thought networking was like all of the spammy connection requests they get on LinkedIn, or having to go to that mixer and perfect their introduction. Like, it's amazing to me how widespread there is books and articles and TED Talks, whatever, on how to properly introduce yourself. Like, I'm sorry, what? Right? But fundamentally, one of the reasons for that is that they were absorbing all of this how to win friends and influence people or never eat alone advice, and then trying to implement it. And it wasn't that any of that advice is wrong. It's just, if I'm asking you, hey, how did you make such and such connection? You're telling me inside the context of your personality, your knowledge, skills, and abilities, your existing connections. So if I go try and take your advice and apply it to my life, I'm going to feel inauthentic because I'm not being myself in that moment. I'm trying to be you, right? And so, what's the opposite of that? Well, it's the realization, we get this from organizational network analysis, but from other things, that there are fundamental universal principles to how networks form and collaborate. We can study them as a science. It's a whole discipline. It's called network science, right? And what we find is there are several principles that are at play. We already joked about one, this idea of 6 degrees of separation earlier, right? But there are all these different phenomenon at play in every single human network, computer network, electrical grid, any type of thing where there are connections between individual components. They follow certain universal principles. And so the grand theory, I think, is okay, the only way to develop and grow in your own professional network that still feels authentic to you is not to apply someone else's advice. It's to understand what are the universal truths of networks. And then based on that, shape a strategy that works really, really well for you. And that strategy is going to be different for every person, right? But it's going to work because it's in line with those universal principles.
Cool. How do you? Because you mentioned LinkedIn, so I'm a big LinkedIn user. How how should networking really operate on LinkedIn?
Yeah.
Right, like from your perspective.
Okay. Well, this is hard for me to answer because I am full disclosure. I'm a contractor inside of, like, I have several LinkedIn learning courses and that sort of stuff, and so I don't want to be
Yeah,
seen on a podcast trashing them about their product. But I think the biggest mistake they probably made in the last couple of years is they really downplayed the role of groups. Right, LinkedIn groups used to be awesome. You could be in a certain profession and you could dive in and find, it was essentially like it was a 365-day long professional association conference, right? That was perfect again for all sorts of different types of networkers, because one of the things we notice in that's universally true about human psychology, but also about network science, is what Brian Uzi, the researcher, would refer to as the shared activities principle. People make deeper and more authentic connections, not when they're just trying to connect over coffee talks or random. They do it when they're focused on something else, participating in an activity together, doing a sport together, or talking about their profession with each other, right? They're not there to connect. They're there to get answers, share feedback, etc. But in doing that shared activity, they make those connections. You can still kind of do this on LinkedIn now, but you have to really be much more deliberate about who you're following, who you're commenting on, what hashtags you're, like, it used to be a whole lot easier in the world of groups, but that would still be where I would be. Do you remember back in the day, this was like 10 years ago, people used to put the word lion in their profile, right? It stood for LinkedIn Open Networking. In other words, like, I'll just accept any connection request. Nobody cares. Nobody cares, right? Because of course, when I say, oh, you and I have this mutual friend in common, how do you know them? They would always say, well, I don't. We're just connected on LinkedIn. Okay, well then what's the point? Right? So it's not, the way to use a tool like this is not to just send out all of these connection requests or chase down who's a second degree connection of who, whatever. It's just to jump into the conversation. And again, I wish that conversation was still happening in very active groups, but the conversation is still happening. It's just moved into your main feed. And so you just got to be very deliberate about who you're unfollowing, who you're choosing to follow, et cetera, and what conversations you're engaging in. And again, treat LinkedIn like a 365-day long professional association conference, and you're going to get a lot more benefit out of it than if you're just trying to send random connection requests.
Yeah, I love LinkedIn as well, so like definitely, but that's such a great take, right? Because groups are so powerful. Because the funny thing is, you see so many community-based tools blowing up right now. You have tools like Circle, tools like School. So people are looking to build communities, right?
Yeah.
And LinkedIn is obviously not leveraging what they have, right? I mean, you can hardly even find your LinkedIn groups anymore,
Yeah, no,
right? And
that's what I mean by
it's a
minimize.
pity.
They're like often you have to click. Even it's mind boggling why you would sort of. I mean, I'm sure there's a profit and loss reason for it. I get it. I don't have
Yeah,
access to any of that information, so I'm sure there's
yeah,
data behind the decision. It's just as a former power groups user, it's just sort of sad to see. And you're exactly right. And by the way, maybe that's the strategy, right? People are looking for community. If you get out there and you can't find one, go start it, right? Start posting content about that specific topic and start moving people over to a group you run in Circle or in School or what have you, right? A lot of the
yeah,
thing we find about modern day sort of super connectors is that they're just the ones who took responsibility for the community, right? And
yeah.
then in doing so, they happen to be the central node of the community, but that wasn't their aim. Their aim was, hey, there isn't a current community for this group of people. I'm going to start one.
Yeah, no, I love that advice, because it's necessary, and it's definitely something that's critical. I mean, maybe let's talk about then Jon Levy, right?
Yes.
First off, I need to know: have you been to a dinner?
Yeah. No, Jon. Actually, I was just in New York a couple weeks ago on a very long walk and talk with Jon as he's writing his next book. John's fantastic. I've been
To
and
tell
I've been to
tell
a
people who he is. Tell people who he
yeah.
is and why he's important, because I found that to be such a fascinating story
Yeah.
in the book. Why? Because it brings the
Yeah.
humanity out in why you do
Yeah.
networking, right?
Yeah.
So maybe just give a quick backstory on
So
that.
John's such an interesting character. Jon started this is a great example of that shared activities principle we were talking about. Actually, Jon started this recurring dinner that eventually grew into what he started to refer to as the influencers dinner, because the goal was to get people who are influential, maybe not well known, but influential in a variety of different fields together. But there are very specific rules for how Jon's dinner works. First of all, if you're invited, you go. You don't get to send somebody else. The invitation's not transferable, et cetera, right? Like, you go. When you arrive, you find out that, number one, like, dinner isn't going to be served. Dinner is going to be cooked. We're all going to be working together to cook this dinner collaboratively, right? A lot of times. And you're going to be paired with somebody. And there's a couple rules there. One of the biggest rules is you don't tell them your name or what they do, which is funny because those are the first two questions we normally ask when we're meeting someone. Who are you and what do you do? Nope, can't use those, right? You can use your first name, but nothing like if your full name would identify who you are, or I suppose if you're one of those crazy people who only has one name because you're that identifiable, right? Then don't say a name at all, make one up. But the idea is you're going to spend a set amount of time kind of preparing this dinner, and everybody's got a different set of tasks in all of these groups. You're going to start prepping that and having this conversation. And since you can't talk about who you are and what do you do, you got to find other things to talk about. So you end up talking about hobbies and habits and things that are outside of your normal scripted responses. And then you sit down to dinner and you learn like who everybody else is, right? Which is a ton of fun because you often find out you got it tremendously wrong. Like, oh, actually, this person's the chief marketing officer at Nike, or this person is Scandinavian royalty, right? Or this person, you may have never heard of her, but she's actually who picks the dresses at the Met Gala. So she's incredibly influential. Like you learn all of these crazy stories about people that you never would have guessed. But the more important thing is, because you dropped your script and because you started exploring, first of all, because you engaged in a shared activity, so you had a more authentic conversation, but you also couldn't use your normal script that we all hide behind. you had to talk about other stuff. And in doing so, you found what in psychology we call these uncommon commonalities. You found things in common with that person that are usually outside of what's your script and outside of what's their script. And now, even though you find out that that person is Scandinavian royalty, you're like, yeah, but we still also love cricket. Like, we just have that in common for some reason. I'm making it up, but although I do have a cricket bat behind me in the video, which is kind of funny. You just find those things in common. And because you have those kind of non-work things in common, you end up interacting with that person much more frequently post-dinner because you have other things to talk about than just sort of work-related stuff. We often approach this whole concept of networking based on who is going to be beneficial to our professional life. And the truth is, you have no way of knowing that, because the world is just such an interconnected place where people take all sorts of career detours and pivots and what have you, that you have no way of being able to predict who's going to be most influential in your career 5 years down the road. So the better strategy is just to develop as many deep and authentic connections with a diversity of people as you can, and just put that into the network as a whole, and trust that it'll come back to you beneficially. And that's what those sort of influencers dinners do. Jon's kind of leveled up the approach. During COVID, you obviously couldn't have an influencers dinner together, and Zoom cooking sessions together is a little weird. So he sort of mirrored them into, he's got these dinners that then lead into like salons. So in essence, now the dinner is like your entry point into this broader community. You have to have that experience. And then you have these bigger events where you have, 50, 70, sometimes 100 people together to discuss a specific idea. Right. And again, that's what he refers to as the salon. But the principle is still the same. Like, the way you get connected into this network that he's put himself at the center of, speaking of building communities, right, that's been super beneficial to him. The way that you do all of that is through a shared activity where you're ditching your traditional script and just focusing on connecting with that person and trusting that it'll be beneficial in the end.
Yeah, that's such an amazing story. I really, really, really love that. So looking at the time, I have one last question for you.
Okay.
Jim Rohn used to always say that you are basically the aggregate of the 5 people you spend the most time with. Right? Do you believe that?
No. I mean, it's a bit like what we were talking about earlier with Simon Sinek. He's not wrong. He's just short-sighted. If you look at the network science research, there's this phenomenon called the 3 degrees of influence. You Google that, or Google Nick Christakis or James Fowler, and you find this 3 degrees of influence. Basically, they took this large-scale network model, and they found out that, yes, the people your primary connect, to use LinkedIn terms, your first order connections are influential in your life. And yeah, the people you interact with the most are going to have that sort of biggest influence. But the thing a lot of us don't realize is that your second order connections, and even your third order connections, people you don't know but have a friend of a friend of a friend, still have some influence on you, because there's like a cascade of influence, right? And so the reason I think this is so important and so much better than sort of Jim Rohn's is that if you're thinking about who you need to be better connected to, if you're trying to change a habit in your life, you're trying to change something like that, it's not just like, oh, pick new friends, which is candidly is also how cults get started, right? Ditch all of your old associations and only hang out with these people. It's that you want to pay attention to that whole network. You want to move slightly closer to the people who maybe you aspire to be like one day, but you also want to pay attention to who's influencing them, because you never know what's going to happen again down the road, right? And so it's not about being connected to 5 people. It's about what is the community that I'm a part of, where these second and third order connections are going to happen, and the way those have a subtle social influence on me as well. That's a far more important question, right? Is this broader, again, to just berate a dead term, to broader network analysis, right? To look at this broader community, this network that I want to be a part of. It's a way bigger deal than just, oh, I need to spend more time with this person and less time with this person, right? It's what is that broader community, that section of the network that I need to deliberately move myself to.
Amazing. That's something new to think about. So, David, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. Maybe tell people where they can find you online. We would like people to learn more.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you've gotten this far, right, I'm going to assume that you liked what you listened to. You weren't just like hate listening to everything. And so you probably already know that the easiest place to find me is show notes and on this page, etc. If you go there, they're going to link to davidburkus.com, Burkus. I'm really lucky. That's a very odd, rare name. So all the domains were still open. So you type that as a .com. You could search it into Google and find me on whatever network you want to be a part of. We at least post content there. I can't promise that we respond quickly there. I can if you do it on LinkedIn. But anywhere else we'll find, however you want to keep the conversation going, we're there. And I hope we do, because none of the things we talked about today, we solved today, right? These are ongoing conversations. And so I hope we connect and keep that conversation going.
Absolutely. We'll need to do a part 2.
Love it.
So thanks so much. And thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening to the Aspire to Inspire podcast. Have a great one and see you on the next show. Hey, if you're getting value from today's conversation, make sure you subscribe right now so you don't miss any future episodes of the Aspire to Inspire podcast.